For people who are just surviving within the system, trying to survive, not only survive within the system, but also change that system is too much for people, right? Surviving, I just want to emphasize that being able to survive an oppressive system is enough, right? Being able to work within an organization or an institution that is oppressive and that is harmful because you don't have the ability to leave is enough, right? You don't need to also simultaneously try to change that system unless you have the energy and the capacity to do so. Hey y'all, Jay Nice on the mic. I wanted to make this video because I saw a video and it had my wheels turning. The video that I watched was talking about a Black celebrity and whether it's possible to infiltrate a system and change the system from the inside. And I actually have written, in 2021, I wrote an article about this, which I will link in the description box below. But I feel like it's important to discuss this idea of change from the inside, because it's actually a topic that I discussed in my new book, Rise and Resist. I have a chapter called Systemic Resistance. And I talk about people who infiltrated systems in order to change those systems. And one of the people I talked about in the book was Thurgood Marshall. And for those of you who are not familiar, he was, the most notable role, or what he's most known for, is that he was the lawyer that helped with the Brown versus Board of Education case of 1954, which was essentially the pivotal, groundbreaking Supreme Court case that made school segregation illegal. And in the book, I talked about how Thurgood Marshall infiltrated the system. He learned the lay of the land, he learned the laws, and he used those laws to help desegregate schools. And I think it's an important conversation that we should constantly be asking ourselves, especially if any of the folks who are watching this right now are people, if any of you are people who want to push for change, if you see yourself as a change maker or somebody that wants to drive change, whether it's actually possible to create that change from the inside. And in my article, I talked about how, while I do think it is possible to drive change from the inside, and specifically like in the context of a workplace or an organization, I think it's possible to create change from the inside, but I think it's really, 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 really hard. Because the effort, especially if you're a Black person or you're somebody with marginalized identities, just navigating a white system or structure is enough, right? It's a lot to navigate systems and structures that are oppressive. But on top of that, if you're trying to change these systems and structures, it's really, really difficult. And there was an amazing post by someone called Black and Embodied. I follow her on Instagram, and she had this post that I actually cited in the article that I wrote, where she basically, I'm paraphrasing, said something like, is it really, like, people don't think about the effort that it takes to try to change a system that you are part of, because if you are a change agent or a change maker of some sort, there's already a lot of pressure on you. And especially if you're somebody from a marginalized background, you're trying to navigate those systems yourself. And trying to do that and survive is enough. But on top of that, if you're trying to transform those systems that you're part of, it is really difficult. And I think for some people, it can prove to be just, I don't ever want to say anything is impossible, because I don't think impossible actually exists. But I think that it's really, really it's just a really difficult feat. And we have to consider, when we join these systems and these workplaces, we have to consider the difficulty and the undertaking that is required to actually transform those systems. My very first journal article that I ever wrote, where I was a first author, I talked about this. I talked about it from the context of consulting, right? Because I'm an external consultant. I work outside of organizations as an outside entity to help them transform things from the inside. And in the article, I will name my bias because I work externally. I talked about how I felt like when it comes to workplace changes and changes within an organization or an institution, I think it's easier in many ways, or it's less challenging to change an organization that you are not part of, right? So I think change from the outside is much more feasible. And the reason for that I wrote about in the journal article is because of when you're part of a system, you're keenly aware of the internal politics. There's a lot of red tape. And then also this idea of how will you actually change the people that sign your paychecks? That is a really challenging and difficult feat that we don't often fully consider when we enter these systems with the goal of trying to transform them. And so this question keeps coming up of how do you actually change the people that are your managers and that are responsible for keeping you employed? And a lot of people who are trying to change things from the inside hit a wall because they realize that the more they try to push and push and push, the more precarious of a position that puts them in. Like, we don't talk about how difficult it is when you're inside a system trying to change it and you're pushing and pushing and pushing. And oftentimes what happens is people who are trying to create change from the inside reach a wall because we live in a world where we have to work. People have to get money to survive. And if you recognize, which many people within systems that they're trying to change end up realizing, is if you push too much or you push too hard, you will lose your position within the organization. And that could affect your viability, your ability to feed your family. And so I just think that when you are pushing for change from the inside, it is not impossible, but it's very challenging because of these reasons, because your position is threatened. If you don't need the job, I think it's much easier to push for change, but 99.9% of the population needs to work, and people aren't just working just for the fun of it. And so that's why I think when we consider how to push for change and what it will take to actually transform a system, I think we have to think beyond just this idea that we're infiltrating the system and we're going to change it. I heard people say this a lot when it came to Jay-Z partnering with the NFL, right? People who have said that it's okay what Jay-Z is doing or what Jay-Z has done because he's infiltrating the system and he's trying to change it from within, right? And I got into a conversation with somebody who was like, that's how you create change. You enter the system and you drive change. And I'm like, okay, based on that logic, what has Jay-Z actually changed? What are the material realities? What are the systemic changes that Jay-Z has actually been able to implement besides getting more diversity among the halftime show performances? How is that leading to systemic change within the NFL as an institution? How is that bettering the football players' experiences? How is that making them safer? How is that protecting them from CTE? All of these questions come to mind when we use this excuse of infiltrating the system to try to change it from within. Again, I don't think that it's impossible because I think Thurgood Marshall is a great example of systemic resistance where he infiltrated the system. He learned the law and he used what he knew and his knowledge of the law to push for changes. We have to think about the effort that is required of us when we try to push for change within a system, especially these legacy systems that have been around for so long and that are very resistant to change. More often than not, what ends up happening is for people who are just surviving within the system, trying to survive, not only survive within the system, but also change that system is too much for people, right? Surviving, I just want to emphasize that being able to survive an oppressive system is enough, right? Being able to work within an organization or an institution that is oppressive and that is harmful because you don't have the ability to leave is enough, right? You don't need to also simultaneously try to change that system unless you have the energy and the capacity to do so. And sometimes the most powerful thing that we can do from inside the system is to exit the system, right? And I talked about that in my book. I don't think that that's feasible for everybody. And in this economy, I would not advise anybody to leave or quit their jobs. But I think what I want to emphasize is the very real sort of burden that we take on when we are not only part of an oppressive institution or organization or system, but when we try to change that system from within. I think we are better equipped to try to create changes in the workplace from the outside. And again, I am naming my bias because I do work externally. I feel like this is the best way to do this. I say this also as somebody that was part of a university. I was working full time in a university, and I was also trying to change things within the university, and I wasn't successful in doing so. And so I think I also speak from a place of experience and not somebody who has always tried to change things from the outside. You know, for me personally, it was very difficult, and I did find that I hit those walls where I was like, I can only push so much, because if I push too much, I risk losing my job. And I'm not in a position at that time. I was not in a place where I could just up and be like, peace out. So I do, you know, to answer this question, is it possible to change a system from within? While I do think it's possible, I think it's very challenging, very difficult. And I think our efforts are best spent pushing for change from the outside whenever possible. Again, I just want to emphasize that I don't think enough people say this, but it's okay to simply just endure a system without also simultaneously trying to change it. And I'm not saying this to silence anyone or to make anybody feel like they're being complicit, but there's so much effort. And I say this to somebody who does change work, and I do this from the outside. It is exhausting. So I can only imagine somebody who's part of that system trying to change it, how overwhelming it is. So just remember that it is enough to just, I think surviving within oppressive systems is resistance, right? And is enough. And we don't have to feel like we have to take on that burden if it's just too much for us. So I would love to know your thoughts on this topic. Again, I'm going to leave the article that I wrote around whether it's possible to change an environment from the inside in the description box below. I'm also going to leave a link if you want to check out my new book, Rise and Resist, where I talk about Thurgood Marshall and how he infiltrated the system and was able to resist. I also talk about Virginia native Maggie Walker, who also infiltrated the system and was able to resist in her own ways. But yeah, I want to know your thoughts, whether you feel like it's possible to change a system from inside. And if you have seen that happening, what sorts of tools and strategies were utilized to change the system from inside, whether you're somebody who has transformed the system from the inside. Again, I think speaking from personal experience, I don't think it's impossible. I just feel like it's very, very, very difficult. So thank y'all so much for watching, and do all the things, you know, that you know, it helps the channel. Like, subscribe, share this video if you found it insightful and informative. And thank y'all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.